There's been a little bit of a social media report, if you will, and I'll use report in quotes, that Oregon has unlimited NIL resources. Now, you've probably seen this on Instagram from various pages, and they're not necessarily trying to feed misinformation, but I do think it has been taken with a little bit too much of a literal nature to it. If you're watching right now, make sure you subscribe. We appreciate you in advance for that. College football, nothing but college football, every single day right here on this channel. So make sure you're locked in. Make sure you're following on the podcast. Make sure you're following me on the social channels at JD Piquel. We appreciate you so much for that. That's on Instagram and on Twitter, by the way. So where this whole thing is coming from is there was a tweet that came out, and it was a true tweet to my understanding. Rick Neuheisel, former head coach of college football, does a great job now in the media, said on ESPN, College Football XM, so a radio show, that he went to a recent coaches event and said that it is no secret that Phil Knight, Nike essentially, wants to see a national championship. He's 86 years old. He's getting older in age. He wants to see a natty. And so the way the tweet was worded is, it's no secret that Phil Knight is supplying unlimited resources to Oregon on the NIL front. It also said that they are willing to pay whatever it takes. Now, is this true? I think in theory it could be true. But I think the thing that people took from this was a literal, legal, hey, Nike has opened up the war chest. They will give you whatever. There's no limit to what they're going to give you, all right? Is that true? I think unlimited feels a lot more like another word for a lot. You know, like I don't think they're actually giving them like billions of dollars, if that makes sense. There's no legal receipts that prove that Oregon is getting unlimited resources from Nike. But however, if Nike wanted to, they probably could, just so we're on the same page. But the thing that was a little bit interesting out of this whole thing, out of this whole, report that more or less, I guess, came out, and report feels like the wrong word, but this rumbling that came out was a lot of people said, see, told you. Told you Oregon was always buying players. They were always just dropping the bag, and that's why they're having success now in the portal and on the recruiting trail. The first thing I would say, which we've said a lot on this show, like if that's what's happening, if they are dropping a bag and they are landing players, good for Oregon. Like if that's truly what it comes down to, them having more money than you or them being willing to spend more money than you, who is that a reflection on? Is it a reflection on Oregon for being willing to pony up and go get big-time players? Or is it a reflection on you for not being able to have the funds to compete with them? You say, JD, yeah, but they're Nike. Okay. Do you want to win college football games? How bad do you want that recruit? If you want it as much as Oregon wants it, okay, then let's play ball. But if you're not matching them financially and you're complaining about that, and that's the reason why you're complaining, like that's the reason why I think they're landing players, like I don't know if it's a good look to yell about being broke. Just my opinion. Just my opinion. Other thing I would say here that's a little bit off-putting about the way people have responded to this narrative of Oregon having unlimited NIL is like the thought that Oregon is just purely being able to pay players and that's the only reason why they're landing them. To me, that's just disrespectful. To me, that means you haven't really been paying attention to what Oregon's actually doing. Well, hey, JD, they landed 2 quarterbacks in the transfer portal. 2 top 3 guys in Dylan Gabriel and Dante Moore. Like, come on. That has a lot to do with money, right? If we're using, common sense here, yeah, they probably didn't get either of those guys for free. But also, are those guys picking Oregon if Bo Nix doesn't have the season he's had last year? Or the resume he's had since he got to Oregon? If Bo Nix isn't projected to be a first-round pick or trending that way, which he ultimately ended up being? I think that probably factors in as much, if not more heavily than NIL. Well, JD had DeCorian Moore, come on, Evan Stewart. Those guys, like, they for sure bought those guys, right? I don't know what the NIL specifics are for either of those individuals. Yes, if they were, if we're going off just their rating, probably have a higher price point than the average wide receiver. But are they even considering Oregon if they don't have anybody that's had solid production at the wide receiver position? If either of those guys don't see a path to them going and playing at the highest level, which is ultimately the NFL? I don't think so. Oregon had 2 1,000-yard receivers last year in Tez Johnson and Troy Franklin. Maybe that helped their case as well in landing those guys. So to say that it's just a money thing to me is disrespectful to what Oregon's done, to what Dan Lanning has done since he's got there. And make no mistake, too, like, Dan Lanning is about that life. Like, there's this thought, I think, a little bit that they're just dropping a bag at the 11th hour after a few phone calls, very little effort put in, and the bag is really what sealed the deal. Nobody's denying that the bag helps. I'm sure it does help. But unless you know without a shadow of a doubt that's the reason why they're landing these kids, I would maybe back off just a little bit. Because when I look at Dan Lanning, man, like I said, he understands what it is. Like, he understands recruiting is what fuels everything. I'll go back to his very first game against Georgia. Kirby Smart takes the podium. They just waxed Oregon. Post-game, he says, Dan will never tell you this, but we won today because we had better players than them. And that was true. Ever since that day, I think that was Dan Lanning's villain origin story, and they have been on a mission when it comes to recruiting. And also, I've said this earlier in the show, I'll say it again, like, Oregon is not necessarily the most talent-rich state when it comes to high school football players. It's not saying there isn't really good football players that exist in the state of Oregon, but the large majority are in states that you would have to jump on a plane to go see. Guys that you probably have to jump on a phone call with, to have a conversation with consistently. Dan Lanning, I have to believe, is doing both of those. Like DeCorian Moore, everyone wants to talk about NIL and being able to land him. Like, nobody was really talking about how frequently they were visiting DeCorian Moore, how much they were building relationships with his family, and all the things that also go into recruiting that everyone seems to want to bypass. And so I think Dan Lanning, does he have support from Nike and Oregon? Like, of course, I would hope so. I think that's probably a big reason why Oregon's having success. I'm not denying that, but I also think to think that's the only ingredient, to me, feels a little bit foolish, a little bit disrespectful. Because at the end of the day, when we talk to a lot of these kids at the NIL Elite Series, and a lot of them tell us the same thing. Yes, NIL matters. However, it's not the only thing. A lot of these kids are thinking NFL more than NIL. All right? NIL doesn't hurt, but I don't think for a lot of these kids it's everything. Take it a step further. People can smell fake from a mile away. It's just some inherent gene we all got. I don't think there's anything fake about Dan Lanning in Oregon. I think the authenticity and the way that he builds relationships and the way that he's been able to continue to build relationships and be real with his players from the time he recruits them to the time they get on campus, I think that matters. I think that's also a very big reason why Oregon has had success. So unlimited NIL feels like a bit of it's like a generic statement. It feels like another word for a lot of NIL from Nike, which we already knew. We already kind of assumed. But regardless, man, it's a lot more than just finances that go into recruiting today. And Oregon is capitalizing on every front. Hey y'all, thanks so much for watching. Subscribe to the channel here to make sure you don't miss an episode of The Hard Count. Also be sure to check out other videos on the On3 YouTube channel.